Good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome to this ENACT seminar on cultural property. We're here to have a discussion about cultural heritage and illicit trade, encompassing a range of opinions and perspectives, and triggered by the recent publication of the ENACT report, Culture in Ruins, a study on the illegal trade in cultural property in North and West Africa. ENACT is a project funded by the EU, and we heartily thank the EU both for the financial support to the project and their participation at this webinar. We have a stellar panel today, Mr. Daouda Keita, Director of the National Museum of Mali and an archaeologist, Katie A. Paul, anthropologist and research analyst and co-director of the Antiquities, Trafficking and Heritage Anthropology Research Project, Rim Dawadi, a practicing attorney and researcher, and Julia Stanyard, an analyst at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. We're here today to talk about the relationship between illicit trade and cultural heritage. Cultural property helps us to construct an understanding of cultural heritage, and cultural heritage is an inalienable part of individual, community, and national identity. And the ability to learn about that heritage is a human right, a right which illegal trade fundamentally undermines. Recently, this issue has received somewhat more international attention due to, in part, intense debates over the repatriation of objects looted under colonial regimes, revelations of illegally traded objects being housed or traded at some of the world's leading museums, auction houses, and collections, and increasing evidence of illegal trade in objects from conflict zones. But there is a general consensus that the phenomenon is still little understood and not much research is being done into the actual trafficking dynamics on the ground. Our discussion today will center around two main themes. Firstly, we'll be hearing about new trends in the illegal trade in cultural property in the region, including political developments, conflict and insecurity, and the advent of online trade. We're also going to be discussing the trends with a view to understanding what measures can be taken to counter the illegal trade, what institutions and source countries can do, and how they can best be supported to reduce looting and manage illegal trade in country, and also how standards can be improved in international art markets. The event is going to be an hour and a half, and we aim to have a 50-50 balance between presentations and discussions, which will mean 10 minutes for speakers to present at a maximum, and questions for speakers can be posed in the chat, or people can raise their hands and I will call on them. We ask that all participants keep themselves on mute while the presentations are being made. And I would also like to inform everyone that interpretation between English and French in both directions is available. You can access that interpretation by clicking on the panel of options at the bottom of the screen. And if you're having trouble with this, please just make a query in the chat box that someone can respond to you. Without further ado, I would like to again invite Mr. Daouda Keita, Director of the National Museum of Mali, to speak. Mr. Keita has been leading the country's work in protecting its cultural heritage, including in measures to counter the illegal trade in cultural property. And he's going to be talking to us about what the situation in Mali is like today. Mr. Keita, please proceed.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la modératrice. Je dois dire que je suis très heureux de participer à ce webinaire pour présenter un peu le cas du Mali et des pays qui sont à côté. Donc, je dois dire que le trafic illicite de biens culturels est une triste réalité au Mali. Et ce phénomène s'est exacerbé avec la crise de 2012 que nous vivons. Et donc, ce qui a fait qu'une grande partie du territoire malien a été occupée par les djihadistes. Et donc, les parties occupées ont fait l'objet d'un pillage immense et d'un pillage systématique. Donc, ce qui a fait qu'une bonne partie de la partie nord du Mali a subi d'intenses pillages, et aussi le centre. Donc, il y a deux cas qui sont bien connus, qui sont bien cités. C'est le cas d'un site archéologique qui se trouve au centre du Mali. Le site s'appelle Goudji Tourela. C'est un site où les pilleurs ont trouvé des objets très importants, notamment beaucoup d'objets en or. Et on estime à plus d'1 milliard de francs CFA les objets qui ont été pillés sur ce site. Donc, ça donne l'occasion à une véritable ruée sur ce Eldorado qui constituait le site de Goudji-Touloula. Et beaucoup de gens sont partis et ils ont extrait énormément de biens culturels qui ont été vendus et ces biens culturels sont déjà hors du Mali. La seconde partie concerne un site qui se trouve à Boré. Et donc, à Boré, qui se trouve entre Mopti et Douenza, donc il y a eu un pillage intensif là-bas. Moi-même, j'ai été dans cette zone en 2014. On a pu souvent compter plus de 1000 personnes sur les mêmes sites, qui habitaient sur le site, qui vivaient là-bas et qui travaillaient. Donc, selon les zones, les pilleurs sont à la recherche des perles, à la recherche des objets en or, à la recherche des statuettes et des objets rares. Donc, à Boré, il était bien possible de voir les marchands qui démarchaient les pilleurs des sites et achetaient les biens culturels sur place. Donc, comme l'État était absent, donc il n'avait peur de personne et il n'avait peur de rien. Donc, les échanges se faisaient au vu et au su de tout le monde, sans danger pour les marchands. Et une fois, on nous a même dit que ces marchands venaient de la Mauritanie, de l'Algérie et du Maroc. Donc, ils venaient pour acheter surtout les perles, qui étaient vraiment très sollicitées et très demandées. Donc, ces marchands faisaient partie d'un réseau. Et donc, la ramification de ce réseau, comme je l'ai dit tout de suite, se retrouvait au Maghreb et quelquefois en Europe. Donc, la crise a fait que ce phénomène-là a pris une ampleur très considérable. Et bon, avec la crise aussi, les frontières de nos pays sont poreuses et on peut facilement sortir avec ces biens culturels sans problème. Donc, ce qui a... donc, dans ce cadre-là, l'UNESCO Dakar a mis en place une formation regroupant tous les professionnels du musée de l'Afrique de l'Ouest pour essayer de voir comment est-ce qu'on peut trouver une solution à ce problème. Donc, à cette réunion, comme je l'ai dit tout de suite, étaient conviés tous les directeurs des musées ouest-africains, certains douaniers, certains policiers et aussi les agents de Interpol. Donc, les communications qui ont été faites au cours de cet atelier ont cherché à comprendre le phénomène, comment juguler ce phénomène et aussi à parler des lois nationales et des lois internationales qui combattent ce fléau. Donc, ces communications ont permis d'éclairer la lanterne des participants et aussi d'insister sur la nécessité de travailler ensemble pour juguler ce fléau. Il était clair qu'un seul pays ne peut pas faire face à ce fléau parce que on le sait que c'est un réseau très bien huilé, alimenté par des trafiquants souvent très puissants et qui ont des moyens importants. Donc, pour lutter contre ce fléau-là, il faut imaginer des mesures qui dépassent un seul État. Et donc, c'est pourquoi cette conférence a demandé à ce que les pays de l'Afrique de l'Ouest se mettent ensemble pour essayer d'harmoniser leur législation et de voir comment les différents services peuvent travailler ensemble pour essayer de juguler le problème. Donc, nous, maintenant, au Mali, nous sommes en train de préparer un atelier dans ce cadre-là, mais au niveau local. C'est-à-dire, nous essayons de former les agents qui sont sur place pour lutter contre ce phénomène. Et ce atelier doit se tenir dans 10 jours. Donc, nous, à notre niveau, on a invité les policiers, les douaniers, les gendarmes, les professionnels du musée. L'important pour nous aujourd'hui, c'est ce qu'on appelle la coopération interservices. On pense que les services doivent travailler ensemble, main dans la main, pour contrer ce fléau. sans une collaboration franche et sans une collaboration étroite, va être difficile. Aussi, un autre problème qui est très important, c'est que ce trafic illicite de biens culturels marche parce que d'un côté, il y a les acheteurs et d'autre côté, il y a des gens qui proposent. Donc, comment faire en sorte pour essayer de casser ce pont? C'est ça aussi le problème, parce que dans les pays pauvres, ceux qui s'adonnent à cette pratique pensent que ils n'ont pas assez de moyens de subsistance ou de moyens pour pouvoir tenir. Donc, c'est pour ça qu'ils s'adonnent à cette pratique. Donc, pour nous, aujourd'hui, il est important d'informer, de sensibiliser les communautés locales qui sont les plus concernées par ce trafic. Aussi, on pense aussi que pour lutter contre ça aussi, il faut voir quelle alternative proposer à ces communautés. Parce que je pense que si on peut proposer des alternatives qui permettent aux communautés d'avoir les moyens de subsistance et d'avoir une vie normale, à mon avis, ils vont cesser ce phénomène. Parce que les enquêtes ont montré que dans certains villages, les pilleurs viennent dans le village, ils logent dans le village, ils cohabitent avec les villageois en pillant les sites archéologiques de ces villageois. Donc, à mon avis, il faut informer ces communautés et leur montrer l'importance de ces sites et montrer qu'en pillant ces objets, on pille une partie de notre patrimoine. Et quand ce patrimoine-là s'en va, pour de bon et ne reviendra plus jamais. Donc, faire de ces communautés des acteurs principaux de la lutte contre le pillage. Et je pense que si on parvient à faire cela, cela va permettre à ces populations d'arrêter le pillage et aussi de ne plus accepter de vendre leurs produits trafiquants. Parce qu'ils ont en ce moment compris la valeur, comment on appelle ça, de ces biens culturels, l'importance de ces biens culturels et l'importance de ces biens culturels pour la reconstitution de l'histoire. Ce qui va faire en sorte qu'ils seront les premiers gardiens de ce patrimoine et ils ne vont plus accepter que ce patrimoine-là soit vendu. En tout cas, moi, je pense qu'aujourd'hui, il est temps de casser le lien qui existe entre les fournisseurs et les acheteurs. C'est seulement en cela qu'on peut faire. Tant que cela n'est pas fait, ça va être difficile. Moi qui vous parle aussi, je sais que dans mon pays, le pillage continue. On continue à piller les sites et les objets sont en train de sortir. Donc, si on parvient à instaurer une coopération internationale, et cela va être, à mon avis, très important pour nous et aussi un moyen très efficace pour nous de lutter contre ce pillage. Seul, à mon avis, il va être difficile pour nous de lutter contre le pillage. Seulement, une coopération internationale peut nous permettre de lutter contre ce phénomène. Ouais, je vous remercie.
Thank you, Mr. Keita, so much for that presentation. It was really interesting to hear about both the shocking plight of looting and illicit trade of cultural property in Mali, but also at the large range of efforts that are going into responding to it. And very interesting to hear your comments both about the necessity of international cooperation and also putting local communities at the heart of responding to active looting events, as well as regional cooperation, which is so often left out of these debates. I'm going to invite our next speaker, KTA Paul, an anthropologist and co-director of the ATAR project, to speak next. The ATAR project is an investigative research project led by a collection of anthropologists and heritage experts digging into the digital world of trafficking in cultural property. They publish groundbreaking work monitoring the trade in cultural objects online, including on major social media platforms. Katie, please share with us your presentation.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me. I'm going to share my screen right now. Okay. So our work for the ATAR project looks at the online trade in antiquities, particularly on social media platforms like Facebook. And understanding why this has become such a major element in the illicit trade of cultural property, we first have to really understand why Facebook. Following the Arab Spring, Facebook growth in the MENA region, and particularly in North Africa, really exploded between 2011 and 2017, where in some countries we see over 1,000% user growth in Facebook. So that has really democratized the looting process. And with a platform that's free, it also means that you have a lot of tools that are accessible to a wide range of the population. So disappearing stories that disappear within a couple hours, online payment mechanisms, the algorithm recommending groups and pages, recommending individuals and traffickers that people should connect with. Here on the left, we have a Facebook story that was posted last spring. This is a genuine artifact, and these Facebook stories disappear after 24 hours. So had we not caught that as it was being posted, that evidence would be gone forever. Facebook's really served as the perfect digital trafficking toolkit because of this, and because people don't have to leave the platform. As a result, we see even in regions in conflict like Libya, people are able to get their wares viewable by thousands of individuals. Here we have several Greco-Roman statues. You'll see one is the same in every photo. This is one user who posted this item for sale across 3 different Facebook groups in about a week-long period. And if you think about transnational criminal organizations and transnational trafficking 20 years ago, most people would need to have in-person, on-the-ground connections to reach potential buyers, particularly in conflict zones. But because Facebook and other social media platforms have democratized that looting process, now anyone can find something, get on the platform, and reach, in this case, tens of thousands of individuals in a matter of minutes, and potential buyers for their objects. We see a lot of transnational trafficking, and we see material from North Africa moving outside of the region. Here we have 2, these are genuine Egyptian coffins that were offered for sale in 2017 by a user who was based in Istanbul, Turkey. Monitoring this kind of illicit trade online can also give us a lot of new information to understand the types of networks that are taking place. But it's not just Antiquities. We see a lot of crossover with the illicit wildlife trade that's being monitored by myself and my colleagues at the Alliance to Counter Crime Online. And a recent study that we did found that pages selling ivory and rhino horn, as you see here, often have a lot of transnational connections. So this page has 2 page managers, one based in Libya and one based in Italy. We know that there are major trafficking routes between Libya and Italy, so it's not surprising. But Facebook is really facilitating that and providing tools to allow this kind of trade to continue. We also see artifacts offered from places like Sudan. Here we have a user, as he's looting, actually posting the artifacts that are available. And it's a good example of how Facebook's algorithms make it even easier for traffickers to connect. You can see this user has a badge that calls him a conversation starter. That means a lot of people are commenting on his posts, which wouldn't be surprising in the world of Facebook, except in this case, this is a group dedicated to Facebook Antiquities trafficking. And that means that the comments on this post are comments of interested buyers. So if he's a conversation starter and the algorithm has identified him as such, that means that he is posting a lot of material and getting a lot of interest for the illicit material he's posting for sale. Our project has studied, so far we're currently monitoring over 130 Facebook groups, mainly in the Middle East and North Africa, but we're also following groups in countries like Thailand, Indonesia, and Ukraine. We do not use data scraping. We do all of this recording manually to ensure we don't miss any information. And so far, we've recorded over 4,000 screenshots of posts and artifacts that have been offered for sale. The groups that we're monitoring collectively have over 2 million members, just so you can get an idea of this illicit trade. And there are several ways that antiquities traffickers can make money through social media. One is a kumsaks, or in this case, essentially a commission, where the admins of the group are asking users before they join, if they sell an item through somebody they meet in that group, will they pay a commission to the admins of that group as a finder's fee, essentially. In this case, that means that when we know the admins are usually in a different location than the buyer and seller who will make the final exchange of goods, this payment is likely taking place digitally. And if that's happening through Facebook's platform, that means the platform is profiting off of that as they take a cut of any digital payments that take place through their platform. YouTube is not free of guilt in this situation. YouTube actually monetizes videos. So that means that if somebody is engaging in looting and they post these videos that are often points of sale, kind of bait pieces, or even instructional videos, they don't actually have to sell an item for them to make money. YouTube's monetization tools mean that the ad that you just saw running before this video, the paid promotions that are coming up, this particular looter is actually making money without having ever sold an object, thanks to this particular platform. We also see activity like crowdsourcing looting knowledge. This is particularly common in places like Egypt, where looters run into groundwater in tombs. That means that they need to find different ways to pump that water out. And so we see instructions like this explaining how they can pump that water out. We see special instructions and services offering how to help do this for a cut of whatever profits are made. And we even see people offering scuba diving services to dive in underwater tombs. It's a highly sophisticated network where services are offered as well as goods. Here we have an individual who just last month was selling access to a site in Egypt. And while I have the sound turned off on this particular video, you can see it's very deep, and to loot at this scale would require a lot of heavy machinery. In the background, there is a loud buzz of heavy machinery. This is not just labor intensive, it's dangerous, and it's also incredibly expensive, which is why they sell access to sites or brokers who are interested in kind of buying a cut of that. But of course, the most common way that individuals are making money is through trafficking antiquities on the platform. Here on the bottom, we see two items that are both being offered while still in situ. On the right, we have a mosaic in Tunisia. On the left, we have a sarcophagus and the mummy and its cartonnage in Egypt, still in a tomb. This is fairly common. We see large items offered in situ because it's easier to find a buyer before putting in the labor to take out such a large item. We also see material from places like Morocco, and the material ranges from small to large. We have a sword on the right, and this particular user actually solicited expertise from others in terms of what the era of the sword was. That was on the left. On the right, we have a fisherman who actually found a large bronze hand, likely Greco-Roman, and that was off the coast of Algeria. We also see people posting items from the field. This is particularly common in places where mobile phones are widespread now. And so you'll see active looting, we'll see items posted in or near C2. Again, this allows users not only to democratize the process, but Facebook's tools have allowed them to accelerate the process of trafficking. But it's not just antiquities. We see a lot of ethnological material offered. So religious material, both ancient and historic. We see carved ivory. We see works of art from sub-Saharan Africa that are making their way into these illicit trafficking networks. And they've really continued to explode. In fact, this post from just actually yesterday that's listed as Tripoli, Libya in November. This is a group that was created earlier this month specifically for the illicit trade in Jewish manuscripts, books, and artifacts. Nearly all of the posts we've seen so far are coming from North Africa, and many of them from countries in conflict or bordering conflict. The user or the admin of that particular group has been advertising this group in groups that are listed in places like Morocco, where there is a lot of Jewish material. So we're seeing them really capitalize on Facebook's tools to get their message out to a wider audience. We see a lot of other ethnological material offered from conflict, items as large as church bells, and items as small as jewelry. There's really no limit to the scale of the type of material we're seeing offered for sale on Facebook. Now, in the case of Libya in particular, and any country in conflict, this is valuable evidence. Not only is it evidence that can be used for future repatriation, but it's also important for war crimes evidence. This is just an example from our case study where we did a deep dive on 4 of the Facebook groups that we were monitoring, and we found that the majority of the content that was being offered for sale was either coming from countries that were currently in conflict or bordering nations in conflict. And anybody who studies transnational crime really won't be surprised by this because of the way that these illicit networks operate. In Libya, a lot of the material that we see offered is mirroring the type of material we see on the market. I did fortunately just get word that the items in the post on the left were recently seized in Libya. And so that's great that those were seized, but they are a drop in the bucket when you look at the amount of material that's being offered. This is just an example of how this can be used as war crimes evidence. In 2016, the ICC trial on the destruction of heritage in Mali relied heavily on YouTube footage of that crime. But the problem with these social media platforms is that when this type of content is reported to them, Facebook and YouTube will actually erase that evidence if they believe it's showing something violent or violating their policies. In this case, that means they're erasing war crimes evidence. That means that not only are these platforms facilitating illicit trade and in some cases war crimes, they're then helping those criminals cover up their tracks by erasing the evidence. We've really been on a crusade over the past couple of years trying to pressure platforms to archive this evidence and preserve it for future war crimes tribunals. So far, we have had little success, but we hope that they will change their policies in the future. You can see a lot of this information in our report that was published last year, as well as a comparison from the ICOM red lists for artifacts offered on Facebook. And we will continue to be gathering this data in the coming months and hope to have a new report out in the near future.
Thank you so much, Katie. That was really a fascinating insight into, unfortunately, yet another set of actors that we have to hold to responsibility for the illicit trade in cultural property. I would like to invite Rim Dawadi next to speak. Rim is a practicing attorney and researcher. She researches international law and human rights in North Africa and is one of the co-authors of Culture in Ruins, the New Enact study on illegal trade in cultural property. And she's going to be sharing the findings from North Africa, which I think will segue on nicely from Katie's presentation. Reem, you are welcome to begin.
Thank you, Simone. So I will be presenting the North Africa case study. The idea of this research was at the beginning to shed light on the existence of an illicit antiquity market in Tunisia and Algeria, the scale of which is larger than we think. This case study draws on sets of interviews conducted in both countries, Algeria and Tunisia, which have not been the subject of the same volume of research and investigation as have their North African neighbors like Egypt or Libya. Over 30 interviews were conducted with representatives from cultural ministries and affiliated institutions in both countries, law enforcement and custom officers, archaeologists, historians, and researchers, as well as arts and antiquities dealers and collectors. We approached the subjects from the beginning more as an exploratory research. The access to information was particularly difficult in Tunisia. Many interviewees did not reveal any numbers or scale of the market, either because they did not wish to share the information or simply because they didn't know. So now just a historical overview of the, very quick historical overview of the issue. Tunisia and Algeria have many types of material culture in common, dating back to most ancient civilization that governed or influenced the region. Historically, in both countries, the large scale of extraction of cultural objects has its roots in the period of the French colonization. It was emphasized during many interviews with historians in both countries that colonial authority archaeologists and collectors of the time was the legitimate heir of Greco-Roman and Christian heritage in North Africa. Later, objects with Christian and Jewish tradition were not systematically protected by the newly independent states during the 60s. Therefore, they were much easier to loot and to traffic out of the region. In particular, the civil war context in Algeria during the 90s, the trafficking in cultural heritage was allegedly linked to the insurgent and anti-government groups. The security vacuum around historical archaeological sites at the time allowed many communities to claim to just loot and traffic objects out of the sites. Looting in Algeria generally remained fairly consistent over the past decades. In Tunisia, the story is a bit different. During the 3 past decades, and right before the revolution actually, corrupt control of illegal markets was under the ex-president's family, ex-president Vali family, like the Trabelsi and Maturi families particularly, who reportedly dominated the country's trade in archaeological objects and antiquities. According to our interviewees, these leading families directed illegal excavations, collected objects at their properties, as well as classified archaeological sites, and then smuggled them abroad to international markets. Many pieces of these collections were seized after the revolution, and perhaps the most emblematic example of these objects trafficked and traded is the Gorgon marble mask, which was stolen during the 90s in the site of Hippo Regius in Annaba, Algeria, and which then was discovered right after the revolution, decorating the swimming pool of Ben Ali's sons-in-law residence. Officials in the cultural ministries and regional governments also were considered to be complicit with the Ben Ali regime appetite for antiquities. For example, a former mayor of Tunis was persecuted between actually 2011 and 2015 for his involvement in antiquities trafficking under the regime. Interviewees generally reported an exponential increase, like exposed by Katie earlier, an exponential increase since the revolution in the number of illegal excavations and exports of objects without detection from Tunisia since the revolution, and especially during the period of 2011-2013. Now, a more contemporary picture of this market. The modern day trade in Tunisia, meaning since 2011, there is an interlinked regional criminal economy between Tunisia and Algeria that we at least could observe for these 2 countries. Countries are actually smuggled between both countries in both directions and then internationally. Most interviewees in both countries insisted on the lack of reliable data, however, which reinforced the picture that looting continues both countries, and the demand is still the same, or even bigger than before. In Tunisia, for example, just to give a few figures, in Tunisia, 35,000 objects were seized and consigned to the National Institute for Heritage between 2011 and 2018. The National Heritage Institute is the main institute in Tunisia in charge of the preservation and the restoration of historical sites. In Algeria, 123 individual cases of antiquities trafficking were investigated between 2016 and the first quarter of 2019, in which 8,600 objects were recovered. Among these 8,600, there were 7,500 of ancient coins, just to show you how interesting are these objects to collectors. In isolation, these figures can seem abstract. Actually, they cannot be a reflection of the size of antiquities markets, but it just gives an idea about the fact that the vast majority of objects are understood to be trafficked without detection from the region, and those seized are only a small proportion of the whole. Concerning the most affected regions now, according to interviewees, eastern sites in Algeria and western sites in Tunisia are the most affected. These sites are close. Actually, the Algerian, the Tunisia and Algeria share a border, which historically was the seat of many Roman cities or Numidian or cities from the Numidian era. So this area is very, very rich in terms of antiquities, and also it's very poorly guarded. So logistically, it's convenient to export objects from Algeria and Tunisia and the other way around. The southern cities, especially those in remote desert locations, particularly in Algeria, are difficult to supervise for authorities, and illegal excavation can go undisturbed in those areas. Concerning the hubs, trade hubs, interviewees revealed that the trade of looted objects naturally gravitates toward some regional hubs for art and antiquities trading, including some cities mentioned by interviewees. For example, the Medina, old town of Tunis, city of El Jam, which is in Tunisia as well, which is built around the Roman Coliseum and has been a commercial hub for centuries. Actually, I think it's a commercial hub for even more than 10 centuries. It's thousands of years. So there is and it's specialized not only in antiquities trade, but also in various forms of informal commerce. It's famous for its avenues of shops selling contraband objects from Algeria and Libya, etc. It was described as a hub for smugglers. Pieces are gathered together in storages. According to an interviewee from the National Heritage Institute, they said that there were storage in which you found other types of illegally traded goods and antiquities, and then they were dispatched to the touristic areas close to El Jam city, which is, for example, the city of Sousse and Monastir, which are very touristic. So the market is flourishing there. Concerning routes, there are three main routes.
I'm going to ask you to just start towards wrapping up, if you can. Just move in the direction of concluding.
Okay. Okay. So there are three main types of routes. Overland routes, which link Algeria and Tunisia, have been described as the easiest and the most common. Objects are understood to be included with other forms of contraband transport between Tunisia and Algeria by car and truck in both directions. Just to sum up, there are also the sea and air transport hubs, which are used usually to transport objects out of the region towards Europe and the Gulf countries, and Turkey as well. In terms of destination and markets, as I mentioned before, interviewees confirmed that objects from the Roman and Punic period are generally destined to Europe and the US, while the Islamic period objects are usually destined to Gulf countries and Turkey. Concerning key actors now, so there are three types of key actors that we could observe. widespread subsisting looting actors, usually people without any particular expertise in archaeological excavation. They usually live in areas close to archaeological. So then these small finds resulting from these, not technician, expertise or unexpert excavations, usually ancient coins. They are then brought to owners of antiquity shops and like in cities like Jem and Tunis and Algiers. The second key actor, archaeologists who either intend to protect or benefit from the sale of objects. In both countries, many archaeologists are believed to be involved in looting and illegal excavations. The archaeologists that were interviewed describe a complex situation. Sometimes they say they keep objects in their own properties and houses to protect them from looting. So because the measures of protection on sites are not sufficient. So that was mentioned both in Tunisia and Algeria, which is very interesting. And the third group is the professionalized network that deal with higher volume of contraband. So it was observed in Tunisia that since 2011, professional networks of smuggling entered this looting, the antiquities looting field, and due to lack of security and political instability in the country and in Nigeria as well, especially at the border regions, more criminal actors could come into the market, and even using, as it was mentioned before, new technologies like social media, etc. It's just the final point I'm making.
Final comments. Yeah, thanks.
Yes, it's the final one. Thank you. So usually corruption at several levels was cited as the key driving factor for trade of antiquities in both countries. Corruption in cultural ministries and the management of sites is seen as a driving factor. State officials and representatives of cultural institutions were historically implicated in antiquities market, both as passive and active participants. Corrupt custom officials at seaports who turn a blind eye on trafficked objects, gatekeepers of sites and museums who also profit from the weak protection of sites. Also the very weak institutional response. So in both countries there are police brigades or security sector brigades in charge of investigating these kind of crimes, but the issue remains very marginal and does not seem to be a political priority. So these brigades don't have really the means to really, even though there are success stories in dismantling networks that we hear of very often actually, but it's just, as I said before, it's just a small proportion of what is really happening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rim, for that very comprehensive discussion. It's always, of course, very sad to hear about the complicity of institutional actors and even archaeologists. And that's an issue that cuts often to the heart of so many of the difficulties of responding to these issues. So thank you for raising it. We're now going to move into our final presentation before we open things up for a Q&A. I'll just remind everyone, if you have questions that you'd like the speakers to address or the panel, you can write them in the chat box and we will raise them in the Q&A session. Up next, we have Julia Stanyard. Julia is my colleague and analyst at the Global Initiative. She's been studying issues related to cultural property and the illicit trade of cultural property for several years, and will be presenting some of the findings included in the Culture and Ruins paper from Nigeria. Julia, please begin.
Thanks very much, Simon, and thank you to everyone who's joined the seminar today and for joining the discussion. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to discuss this research because while it's such an important political topic, the dynamics as they are manifested in the region aren't always particularly well understood. So as the discussion so far has centered around new trends that we're seeing in this illegal trade, Katie has really succinctly put the case for online trade being a kind of new frontier in this market. And Monsieur Keita has powerfully described the new threats that the National Museum in Mali is facing, and Reem has covered Algeria and Tunisia. As Simona said, I would like to focus on some of the findings from our research in Nigeria, where we looked at the political economy of the market in NOC terracotta objects as a key case study. I would also like to discuss briefly the findings of some interviews that we also did with Antiquities dealers operating in market countries in Europe and in the US, which we did as a complement to our research in West Africa, to kind of understand both ends of the spectrum as it is globally. And then I'd then like to draw out some conclusions from those particular case studies to how the rest of our discussion, and find out how this is relevant to the rest of the region. So to kick off with the Nigeria case study work, the NOC terracottas will be very familiar to a lot of the archaeologists in the room. But for those of you who have not heard of them before, they're some of the most ancient forms of figurative arts on the continent, from about 900 to 300 BC. And they're very kind of stylized terracotta sculptures, mainly of people and animals excavated from sites in an area kind of northeast of Abuja. And they have been identified as at risk by the International Council of Museums. They're one of several forms of Nigerian heritage which are affected by looting. And to put it simply, almost every single NOC terracotta which has been excavated over the last 6 decades or so has left Nigeria to be sold on the international market. Which is obviously true of some other forms of heritage in Nigeria as well, but the NOC is a particularly well-known example. And before going on to new trends in this market, it makes sense to set some of the historical background. So in trading of NOC terracottas, the kind of boom period was really in the late 80s and early 90s, when this was really for international art dealers an unknown form of African art, and there was a lot of interest in it, there was a lot of speculation, and people were investing heavily in them, and the prices were really kind of skyrocketing. And we were told by dealers who were there at this time that huge quantities of these objects would be exported from Nigeria to Paris, to Brussels, to New York, to international art dealers. And they were operating through agents who'd be able to transport these objects to neighboring countries from the region itself. And this interest in turn triggered a huge amount of organized looting in the region, whereby local dealers would command maybe up to 100 people to excavate a particular site for these terracottas. And the estimate of around 100 came from an interview we did with one person who was acting as an intermediary in this market at that time. So that was really the kind of crux period for it. Today, the market is in fact much smaller. There's been a decline in international demand, which I'll cover slightly later. But this is also due to insecurity in the region where these NOC objects are excavated, which has made it apparently more difficult for the intermediaries who would buy these objects and take them to neighboring countries to travel. And that was what was reported to us when we did our research, which was prior to any travel restrictions from COVID-19. However, despite the decline in demand, it's not to say that looting isn't still a problem today. It's still seen as a critical problem for NOC sites. And one local dealer put it quite simply that even if these objects can be sold at a giveaway price on international markets, even if it declined that low, it's still a form of income for local diggers and local looters, because they never saw a high proportion of this international value anyway. So it still would afford them a means of income and a means of making money. But one particular thing I'd like to focus on from the way that the market currently operates in Nigeria is the role of an organization called the Artifact Rescuers Association in Nigeria, and how their role relates to policies which have been taken by Nigeria's National Commission for Museums and Monuments in an attempt to reduce the illegal trade. because they're a particularly interesting case study and something that we didn't see in any of the other countries that we looked at for this research, and something I have not heard described in any other research into illegal trade around the world. So officially, the Rescuers Association, or ARON as they're also known, a civil society organisation. They're supposedly artefact rescuers who buy cultural objects that would otherwise be illegally exported from Nigeria or destroyed. And according to members of this organisation themselves, they are a mixture of community leaders and former illegal antiquities dealers. And they have co-opted these people into their organisation so as to protect heritage rather than to sell it. However, it does seem that at least some members of this organisation continue to trade legally in protected objects, not only NOC, but also other forms of Nigerian heritage, and they use the legitimacy of being seen as a member of this organisation and their association with Nigeria's own National Commission to be able to do this with impunity. And within our research, we actually were offered objects for sale by members of this organisation, and people described this to us. People offered to sell objects either directly or via contacts, and others described how they used like violent or even intimidatory tactics to ensure that they were able to buy particular objects rather than other illegal antiquities dealers who are outside of this organisation. Before we published the study, we obviously gave them the opportunity to respond, and they refuted the claims, but also said that some unscrupulous elements of the organisation may hide under the guise of being members in order to orchestrate illegalities. And that is actually precisely what we found and observed. And the reason I bring them up as a particular case study is not only because it's as unusual, but because the organisation has actually arisen alongside an unusual policy adopted by Nigeria's National Commission of Monuments to buy looted objects from antiquities dealers in Nigeria to prevent them being trafficked abroad. And this organisation operates as a kind of conduit between the two. And in fact, this was related to us by several people within the National Commission as becoming a policy because the Commission is actually underfunded to conduct its own archaeological research, to conduct its own outreach to communities, to protect heritage, to work with customs, to work with the police, to prevent trafficking. So this is seen as a potentially more pragmatic and more passive policy approach, that they think if we're not able to fulfill that mandate, then we will take this approach in the hope that it will at least stop some objects leaving Nigeria. So I think that the point that we can take from this example and make relevant elsewhere is that this organisation has arisen in response to a national institution not having the resources to effectively fulfil its mandate. It's not only underfunding, but there are also corruption issues within the National Commission that were reported to us. And they've instead ended up relying on an organisation which actually also has criminal elements as well. So I think that if anything, that demonstrates the need for these institutions to be given the resources to manage heritage and cultural property and to be able to fulfil their role and to do outreach to communities in the way that Monsieur Keita so eloquently described before. Whereas in Nigeria, this is manifested in a very different sort of situation. To move on slightly from the Nigerian context specifically, I also wanted to talk about some findings we had from speaking to dealers in the art market countries, which we conducted as part of the same research. So overall, our general finding from speaking to people both within source countries and in market countries is that there does continue to be an active participation by some art dealers and collectors from international art market countries in purchasing illegally acquired objects. And these were interviewees across the board, from police, archaeologists, to museum officials, to some dealers themselves, who were recounting behaviour that they had seen in the market. However, at the same time, it must be said that lots of the dealers that we spoke to said that the market has changed in some ways quite significantly, and that documentation and provenance to afford and to, that gives evidence of a object's legality is now seen in order to be able to command a really high price on international art markets to be essential, whereas before, apparently in decades gone by, this sort of documentation would not have been asked for or necessary. And this was connected to public campaigning about the illegal trade of the kind that the Atoll Project and other research organisations have been doing, bad press, and new legal requirements in some countries, which would obviously seem to be a change for the better. But at the same time, The interviews that we did suggested there's a pervasive sense that this sort of provenance information and documentation could be very easily falsified, and isn't always asked for still. So then the international market continues to be a grey one that interlinks both illegal and legal objects being sold at the same auctions on the same platforms on the same online sites as well. So that these changes that have been observed are potentially still quite superficial. And dealers based in Europe and the US confirmed an ongoing trade in recently exported Nigerian objects. So not from decades gone by, but recently openly sold at auction houses in the West. And one person we spoke to suggested that perhaps the change more is that these objects are brought to smaller auction houses, sold online, in places that they do not garner the same attention and scrutiny if they were sold at the very highest, most prestigious forms of auction. And a very good recent investigation on the NOC objects from the Continent newspaper actually also made similar findings. So in a way, it seems that, as Katie suggested with the online trade, that it is actually democratized slightly, and these objects are being sold at perhaps lower levels or of the market and by different actors than it would be before, but it still remains ongoing. I would also note that there's a slight irony in the fact that, particularly for the NOC objects, what is actually called demand on international markets is nothing to do with the legality, but people actually described it as because there's such a huge amount of fakes which are also sold alongside these objects. And it's the same vulnerabilities to fakes that by selling objects with no documentation or no proof of their provenance, which allows illegal objects to be sold, but also the fakes as well. And apparently that is what has put some buyers off, more than anything to do with the legality of the objects themselves. I would just say as a concluding note that apparently within the last few weeks and months, Nigeria has also made a request for the United States for a bilateral agreement to be made on export restrictions for cultural property. So perhaps there is a piece of good news within this, in that the form of international cooperation that Monsieur Keita spoke about earlier, which is so necessary to reduce this trade, is perhaps taking place in this case. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. That was a really fascinating insight into the dynamics in Nigeria, and particularly this very organized network, ARAN, which is facilitating the trade, and then also very interesting comments about both what has and hasn't been successful about international pressure or public pressure on international art markets. We're now going to move into the Q&A session of this event. And you can raise your hand if you would like to speak. Otherwise, I will be...
Oui, moi, j'ai envie de parler, s'il vous plaît.
Sure.
Ouais, je dois partir parce que j'ai une urgence là. Est-ce que vous pouvez m'excuser?
Mr. Keita, I'm very sorry to hear about your emergency. Please, thank you so much for your very interesting participation earlier on in the event. And I'm sure you'll be missed in the Q&A, but of course we entirely understand.
Merci beaucoup. Au revoir.
Okay, I'm going to call... Sure. I'm going to draw on some of the questions that have been posed in the chat. There are several that refer to sort of questions around the organized criminality in the trade, and I'm going to put sort of all three of them to the remaining panelists. There is a question from Paul Cops around anti-money laundering investigations. Is this something that any of you have come across in your research? Another one from Vincent Figliomeni about suspected or known linkages, if any, between these illicit trading activities and the marketing of illicit goods through organized criminal elements in Italy. And there is a question from Lise Tagzira. Could any of the speakers elaborate on the interactions between the illicit trade of cultural artifacts and other forms of organized crime in terms of the criminal actors involved? Are they primarily focused on just the latter, or are groups engaging in criminal activity in other markets, such as drug trafficking, human trafficking, and so on? That's a set of questions about several organized crime dynamics, and I'll open it up to whichever panelist would like to respond first.
I'm happy to take one if that's okay. In terms of interactions with other illicit trades, from what we're able to observe on social media, we will often see, even in groups that are designated specifically for antiquities trafficking, we'll see traffickers offering weapons for sale, wildlife parts, and drugs. And so there's a lot of interconnectivity between these trades. There's certainly a Venn diagram of overlap. And given some of the criminal elements that we know are involved, not just in North Africa, but also in the wider Middle East region, we do know that there are a lot of materials that are moving together in these illicit trades. Sometimes we'll see them offered together on Facebook, like weapons and antiquities, for instance. But typically what we see on Facebook are kind of the bait posts that are a selection of a larger cache of material that are available. And in many cases, that does involve weapons and drugs. When you look at reports of seizures of antiquities in a lot of these countries, often you will see that authorities have also seized weapons and often drugs in connection to those seizures from the same individuals. So these networks follow the same paths. It's just a different mix of material each time.
Thanks, Katie. Julia,
Simone,
do you
if I
have
might-
any reflections from the West African material?
Thanks, Simone. Yes, just to answer the same question on potential overlaps with other crime types, I'm sure Mr. Cato would have been able to elaborate in much greater detail than I can, but when we were also doing research in Mali, some of the interviewees that we spoke to who were representatives of the Malian army who are operating in the northern region, which is obviously affected by the conflict, did report to us that there are crossovers with smuggling routes for drugs and arms through northern Mali, and that those objects would be moved by the same groups who are smuggling through those routes. I would say that I don't think that's an overlap in terms of who is controlling those trades or selling those objects directly, and that is often in what we've seen controlled by different actors who are catering more to the specific demand, which is for antiquities, which is a more niche one and something that is very different to a demand for for drugs, for arms and so on. But in terms of who is actually able to move antiquities along those same routes, then potentially there is a certain amount of crossover there. I think also just on the question about money laundering, it's not something that became a major part of our research in West Africa, but it is a significant part of general research that's looking into the illegal antiquities trade, particularly in art market countries, and how that's related to forms of money laundering and other forms of financial crime.
Thank you, Julia. Rim, is there anything you'd like to contribute?
Yes, about the interconnection between different crimes. Actually, in the case of the Tunisian-Algerian border and the smuggling happening there, what we understood is that mostly those who smuggle antiquities, they smuggle antiquities among other goods. The most important thing is that these smugglers are really professionals of the area, because it's a very special area. Some of it is desert and the other part is mountainous, so it's quite and they know the routes, the specific routes to avoid law enforcement checkpoints, etc. So we except for the case of the art facilitators in Algeria, which I couldn't really develop during the presentation, but which is in the document, which really seem to be a specialized network of trafficking of antiquities. Except that example, all the other interviews just said that basically the smuggling happened through illicit goods smuggling networks.
Thank you very much, Rim. There are two questions which are directed specifically to Katie. One around the issue of archiving from Lucia Bird. Is there a particular reason, as you see it, that the technology companies have resisted the call to archive the evidence? And then a second question from Suramya Bansal. Were you able to track completion of such illicit transactions and trace buyers in any instance?
So to the point of archiving, before Facebook released their new Antiquities policy in June, that policy that came after about 2 years of intense public pressure, we actually spoke to Facebook several times and really emphasized the importance of archiving and preserving this data. They told us they would not be doing that they would be erasing. And when we asked why they were not able to do that, they said privacy concerns, particularly with reference to GDPR. However, we looked at the details in GDPR, and it does have caveats for content that is evidence of war crimes. So this excuse essentially does not hold up. And really, this is just one of a number of things that these platforms are doing, because legally there's nothing that's forcing them to do so, thanks to tech laws in the United States, since these are American companies. And unfortunately, that is a major problem. We did an op-ed about this in Foreign Affairs back in July, really encouraging Facebook to take a lead on this and create a digital war crimes archive, similar to what it does with the ad archive, but preserving war crimes evidence so that it's no longer active on the platform for people to see in their feeds, but it is still accessible to researchers, to authorities, to lawyers. This is something we have yet to see from this platform or any others. And that's one of the reasons that we really focus on documenting and taking screenshots of so much material, so we can serve as that documentation, at least for the antiquities trade. But unfortunately, we're really up against a flood of material. It's a small team. We do this on a volunteer basis, and there are thousands of posts every day, so it's very difficult to keep up. When it comes to the issue of, I'm sorry, what was the other question?
Tracing transactions.
Tracing transactions. So this really kind of is on a case-by-case basis. We work really closely with the British Museum Circulating Artifacts Project, particularly for material offered from Egypt and Sudan. And some of the material that we have identified on Facebook, we know has been part of investigations. We know where it has gone once it has left the country. We know which countries and dealers it is being traced and tracked. But that information is still under investigation and is quiet. So we don't really share much on that front. When it comes to countries that are in conflict, like Syria or Yemen, unfortunately, there simply is not the infrastructure on the ground in those countries to be able to kind of follow those illicit trades. So we're really relying on any information that we can gain from resources on the ground. For Syria, we are close partners with the Day After Heritage Protection Initiative, which is a Syrian civil society organization that has teams of people still on the ground in Syria. And we work very closely with them, particularly when we see material out of conflict zones like Idlib, to not only identify individuals, but the paths that this material is taking. So, there are examples of mosaics that we saw offered on Facebook in C2. We know that those have since been removed. We know when they were trafficked to Lebanon, and we're trying to trace those best we can. Unfortunately, because of the dynamics of some of those countries, we really just have to kind of wait until this material makes its way to a Western country's borders, where it can be seized by customs there, where there's more infrastructure.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting. I'd like to invite all the attendees. You are also welcome to raise your hand, and I can call on you and you can turn on your video. Don't be shy. Just because I've repeatedly asked you to write questions in the chat box doesn't mean that's the only way you're allowed to do it. I did want to ask, there was a question from Ranger 58. If Ranger is still part of the webinar, if they could perhaps explain their question. I'm myself not entirely sure I understand what's meant by attaining via different levels of exchange. Anyone? No? Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to hear so many questions. There's a question in reference to the Nigerian material, Julia. And Lucetta Lekaka asks, how is the political leadership facilitating this kind of trade in Nigeria, considering they advocate for preservation?
Thanks, Simon. Yeah, just checking off mute. So thanks for that question. One of the things that we were told about the political kind of investment in, political leadership on and investment in cultural heritage protection in Nigeria is that it was perceived among the people that we spoke to who are current and former employees at the National Commission that investment in the institution and in the work that they are able to do has declined in over recent years because of various financial pressures, and that while politically speaking, there are statements that are made to suggest that heritage preservation and particularly obviously the important point about restitution of artifacts is made on the political stage in terms of investment actually in the NCMM's work. This doesn't necessarily translate into financial resources that they can use. There are also people who were describing kind of quite endemic corruption issues within the institution. So there seems to be a little bit of disjoint there between what is said on the political level and what is actually manifested on in the financial level. But also would just emphasize that is obviously something that is true across a lot of countries, that often heritage institutions are vastly underfunded and it doesn't rarely become a political priority for many countries across the world. So in that sense, Nigeria is no exception.
Okay. Thank you, Julia. Very well worded answer. We have a question from Ariel Litke from IOM Dakar. Do actors involved in the illegal sale of cultural goods understand that they are violating international law, including international humanitarian law? And more broadly speaking, that they are engaging in a reprehensible activity? Do they simply see the trade in artifacts as a livelihood opportunity without necessarily understanding the implications, similar to some actors involved in migrant smuggling? Katie, would you like to respond?
Yes, I can take that one. So when it comes to the regions we're looking at, what's fascinating about these vast networks online is that you have a lot of different actors intermingling. So you have people who are essentially subsistence looters. They are economically desperate. They don't want to engage in this activity. In fact, in some of the North African countries, many of them are quite superstitious about the issue of disturbing tombs. There's a lot of folklore around that. They'll specifically hire sheikhs and engage in magic to appease the jinns in the tombs so that they're not haunted if they loot it. And then you also have very well organized mafia networks in countries like Egypt that are extremely connected, dangerous. Some of this larger material that I showed, like the entire coffins, something of that scale does not make its way out of the country by a layperson. These are very interconnected transnational criminal organizations. And in places like Syria, Yemen, Libya, you also have extremist groups. All of these individuals across the board know that this is illegal activity. In Egypt, for instance, the crime for engaging in looting and trafficking is now life in prison. But many people are financially desperate, particularly after the tourism downturn that lasted for years following the Arab Spring. And then right as it was coming back, now we have the coronavirus pandemic, which has worsened that situation. If you look at our Twitter account, actually yesterday, we just posted a brief thread about a mosaic that was offered in situ from Idlib, Syria. And one of the individuals in the comments said, don't destroy the history of your country. Don't destroy that, and that mosaic. And somebody replied with a laughing emoji and said, yeah, go hungry for the history of your country. And that really is the perfect summation of the difficulties that people are facing, because there is this desire to preserve things. And we've seen actual traffickers and looters encourage one another. If an item is so nice that they don't want to sell it to the West or to Americans, that they encourage one another to take it to a museum and then sell other items instead. And so there's certainly an internal struggle among the lay people, but unfortunately, many of these individuals are taken advantage of by the more organized, more connected criminal networks. And all of these people in commingling in the same digital space is particularly dangerous when you throw in the element of extremism, because it provides extremists and terror groups like HTS, for instance, a channel to reach people that would otherwise not be looking at Islamist content, for instance. It gives them a much wider audience to try to indoctrinate people that would not otherwise be within their reach, which is particularly concerning on the socio-political level.
Thank you. It's a very, very interesting set of dilemmas. Would any of the other panelists like to make comments in response to that question?
Yes, Simone, if I may add.
Please go ahead.
So in the case, for example, of Tunisia, there are some regions. I'm going to cite, for example, Gasrin. It's a region in the center of the country, on the west center of the country. It's one of the least, if it's not the least developed region in Tunisia, and there it's a very big hub of different types of illicit trade of all types of goods, and usually people participate in this trade, but they don't see themselves as criminals at all, because the only alternative to going hungry, as Katie just said, is to participate in this kind of trade. So for them, it's just their livelihood. It might include also antiquities trade. I think that people, when they smuggle and they loot antiquities, they are aware it's illegal. At least maybe they're not aware it's against international law, but they know it's not legal. That's why it happens at night, or in remote areas, etc. So, but I think it's more complicated. It's not just, there are criminal networks, there are organized, professional, etc. And there are people who also participate in these networks, but they don't see themselves as criminals. That's the point I wanted to make.
Thank you, Reem. Julia, I don't know if you have any responses on this issue. There are plenty of questions, but it's quite an important question. So,
yeah, thanks, Simon. That was also something that came up when we were doing our research in Nigeria. That there's different perceptions, not only about knowledge of whether this is necessarily criminal activity or not, but even if people are aware of that fact, kind of different perceptions over what constitutes their rights over that heritage, and if it's found on land that belongs to certain people, who are potentially living and farming and working in these areas, different perceptions around what they feel like they should be able to do with that heritage, irrespective of how that maps onto certain legal rights. And especially, if we're taking the example in the NOC region, there's also a lot of informal mining that goes along in that area. And people were describing how there are some cases where these objects will turn up in the course of that mining activity, and then there's kind of dilemma, it turns into a dilemma for those people as to what to do with those objects, whether they can take them to the National Commission to be preserved in some way, or whether in fact the more lucrative, easier and more immediate opportunity is to sell them to a local dealer or local intermediary. It's kind of questions of practicality and perceptions and rights, as well as the legal setup. So I'd like to echo Reem in saying that it's kind of a very complex question. I'd also raise the question of knowledge of legality in the market countries as well. This isn't just a source country issue. That people who are international art dealers and who are able to definitely have the knowledge of what is legal and illegal activity, there is actually potentially more suggestions that there is a grey area there than you might immediately imagine, because people will say, I've been presented to this object as though it's a legal and legitimate thing, and I've got no reason to disbelieve that, or I've done some due diligence work around it and I think that it's okay, even if fundamentally it turns out that actually it was originally looted. So I'd say that, yeah, it comes into both ends of that market, and I think the side on the art market we should also interrogate quite closely and see whether any of those justifications are actually legitimate. I personally don't think that they are, and that actually that's a very different question to whether someone has to feels like they have to loot a site in order to be able to have a form of income. It's a very different question.
Thank you all for very sensitive answers. I'm moving from the very messy grey dynamics in source countries and also the questionable dynamics in retail markets. There is a question from Ian Tennant from GI-TOC. How do the panelists view the impact of discussions on this issue at the UN? There have been discussions at the Security Council and a new resolution under the UNTOC conference of the parties tabled by Egypt, for example. In short, is the UN / international community giving this issue enough attention? Maybe we can go in reverse order, and Julia, Rim, Katie, if you have any responses. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Ian. I'll keep it brief. I'll say again, it would have been great if Monsieur Keita had been able to stay for this part of the discussion, because I'm sure in Mali that's a very relevant issue, because I know that for the UN mission that's operating in Mali and kind of international and regional collaboration over the conflict, that the UN Security Council resolutions will play a big part in what the mandates of those different international forces are. So I think that in that sort of scenario where the illegal trade in cultural property has become part of conflict as well, that they will be very important in that scenario.
Reem, would you like to respond?
Yes, for me, among the recommendations and made by the interviewees, but also by I think about them myself, is in addition to international instruments, it's bilateral cooperation between countries, especially if you take the case of the neighboring countries in North Africa. There need to be. We heard there are security bilateral cooperation already, but the question of antiquities is not enough covered. Or we hear talks about it, but it's not. There is nothing on the ground. So for me, one solution to this problem on the regional / international level is also to really invest in regional cooperation.
Is there a regional organization that you think could take that cooperation forward?
In the Maghreb, as it's not. There is an idea of a united Maghreb, Arab Maghreb, since the 50s or 60s, but it's not really efficient because there are. You're aware of the issues between Algeria and Morocco, and the region is not really united. But at least on the bilateral level, it could work. So yeah. And also, on the bilateral level, also with Europe and with the US. By the way, there are agreements between Algeria and the US, and also one in the making between Tunisia and the US in the field of antiquities, fighting antiquities trafficking. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting, and one would wonder if sort of greater UN attention could provide even more coherence to that kind of bilateral agreement. Katie, do you have specific responses to this question?
Yes. So when it comes to the issue of antiquities trafficking, the UN and UNESCO have taken this seriously, but a lot of the focus has been on capacity building and what can be done in the source countries, when the problem is that as long as there's a market, there will continue to be looting, and not enough focus and pressure is being put on the market countries to address loopholes in their laws that allow this material to easily be laundered. So for instance, as I mentioned, in Egypt, the penalty for looting and trafficking can be up to life in prison in Egypt. That's a really high penalty, but it's not dissuading anybody from engaging in this activity, particularly because one, a lot of people are doing this as a subsistence activity, and two, there is a market for it, and the market is continuing to grow, and they know that the West is where the demand is, and that means a lot of money. So as long as the focus remains on the source countries and what they should be doing, as opposed to the market countries that have the resources but are not closing these loopholes, that's really where I think there needs to be a shift in the way the UN is addressing these issues.
Mm. On that point, I wonder if you could respond to one of the questions from Ranger 58 around, what does it look like in the final destination countries? We've spoken a lot about looting at the sites and, the much kind of messier, obviously criminal elements of this. And we've also mentioned laundering, but what does a final laundered product in this market look like?
Well, a laundered product really kind of depends on the product, right? If we're talking about a sarcophagus, if we're talking about a coin, there's different ways that some of these objects can be laundered. A lot of the material that's looted directly from the ground has obviously never been documented. And as such, if there's some sort of search in a database like the Interpol database or the Art Loss Register or the FBI Stolen Works of Art database, those are databases that focus on material that's previously been recorded and stolen, but not material that's been looted from the ground. So you have the material that's been looted is a lot easier to launder because you can falsify the documentation and be certain that there is no existing documentation to kind of counter those claims. That's one of the reasons a lot of the work we've been doing is so important, because we are seeing objects offered while they're still in the ground or in the field. In a very rare instance, that's the only example we have that item existed and existed in country after the 1970 UNESCO Convention. So laundering material, when it comes to coins, that stuff can be posted up on eBay really from source country, and there's not really any sort of due diligence on it. For the larger items and for stuff from Egypt that we know has made its way into the Western market in Europe, this material is often being offered at galleries, usually private sales. This isn't stuff that's being as publicized as like a big Christie's auction. When there is suspicion that it's potentially looted, the dealers know how to get around those laws. I think Julia kind of discussed this as well. They have a knowledge of the legal issues, and they're more able to kind of navigate that and get around that. We know that there are entire networks of antiquities dealers and people who are preserving items that will clean an item of dirt and make it look like it's been part of a collection for a very long time, as opposed to an item that was freshly looted. So it really depends on the type of material that we're looking at, but there are a number of ways that this stuff can get laundered very easily into the market. And we do also know that there are Western dealers that are engaging with traffickers in these groups. There's one American antiquities dealer who is Facebook friends with dozens of traffickers that we have identified across these groups who have actually offered material to this individual directly on his Facebook page. So there is quite a bit of interaction between the illicit market and the legal market, and that gray area in between is really just about how easy someone is able to cover their tracks.
Okay, interesting. We are almost at the end. I wanted to ask Julia to tell us stories of her informants in Brussels, who she certainly didn't speak to in dark alleys outside pawn shops and gun shops, talking to people involved in the market in retail markets in Western countries. It means going to often very fancy neighborhoods in capitals where people are willing to spend a lot of money. As we're at the end, I'm going to ask the panelists if they have any final words that they want to leave the audience with. Reem, would you like to begin?
Thank you. I just want to thank you everyone for attending this presentation, and to thank the ISS and GI for allowing me to present this paper. And thank also the other panelists for their interesting communications. And you, Simon, of course.
Julia and Katie. Julia, sorry, and Katie.
No, thanks. Just want to reiterate what Reem said. Thank you to everyone who attended. If you want any more information about our research, then please do feel free to get in touch. Or also, the full papers are obviously available online. And hopefully this is something that we can follow up in future research as well.
Great, thanks.
I also just wanted to thank everybody. It was great to be part of such a dynamic group. And one thing I hope that people take away from this, at least when it applies to the way that we see trafficking interacting with tech, is it's really important to kind of step outside of the research world and try to understand the tech law and some of the laws that don't necessarily directly relate to our illicit trades, but have a very serious impact on the way they're able to operate. This is a new area of law and policy that's still developing. And I think it's really critical that people who are experts in these areas are able to influence policymakers in the US and in the EU who can really pressure some of these companies to continue to do the right thing when it comes to these trades.
Okay. Thank you to all the speakers. I think it's been a really, really fantastic webinar, and apologies to anyone who didn't get their question answered. They were really a lot. I encourage you all to look up the researchers on Twitter or to email them if you have questions that you need answered, and of course to read the report, which is really, really fantastic. And again, thank you to the ENACT project and the EU for its support. And goodbye.
Operation Raging Bull netted 53 arrests in El Salvador. The second phase of the operation was conducted across the United States between October 8th and November 11th, and that concluded with 214 MS-13 arrests nationwide.
The security forces see the brutal side, patrolling streets menaced by the gangs through extortion, rape and killing. They have to confront Central America's Murder, Inc.
This is Deep Dive, exploring organised crime from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime.
When you think about organised crime, it's not intuitive that Africa would be a focus. It's not a term or a concept that many necessarily associate with Africa. But from the illegal wildlife trade to human smuggling and oil theft, to blood diamonds, piracy and drug smuggling, Africa is increasingly becoming webbed into the global illicit economy.
During the 21st century, thousands of criminal assassinations have occurred worldwide. They produce a butterfly effect of trauma locally, nationally, regionally, and globally. Despite these efforts to silence, criminal assassinations can be a source of hope and community resilience. In 2019, the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime commissioned approximately 50 profiles of persons assassinated across the world under the Faces of Assassination project.
Unsurprisingly, we got the news on Friday 20th of March that the UN Crime Congress, scheduled to take place every 5 years and due to be held in Kyoto, Japan in April 2020, had been postponed due to the global coronavirus pandemic. We, at the Global Initiative, have been recording a series of podcasts with leading experts who study and track organised crime and related issues.
The coronavirus is having a profound effect on the established structures of our globe. International travel has been suspended, borders have been closed, entire countries are in lockdown to prevent further spread, and health systems are being stretched to their limits. You're listening to The Impact, Coronavirus and Organised Crime from the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime.